From the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics and the Past. I'm your host, Robert Ferguson, coming to you from our opulent studios again, where we have a beautiful view of the outside and it is freezing cold. With me today is a regular guest, Dr. Joel Webster. Joel, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Glad to be back.
Excellent. Excellent to have you back because this podcast is coming out of a discussion that you and I began having about a week ago.
Correct.
And well, I think we've had this conversation many times,
Sure, yeah.
but we had it a little more specifically on topic about a week ago. And we decided to put a pin in the conversation because we thought it was just too good.
Yeah,
And we were going to need to have it, we were going to need to record it.
exactly.
So, Joel, the conversation that we were hoping to have is one on realignment. And by realignment, what do you think? What do you think I'm talking about, Joel? Anyway, I mean, let's make sure we're on the same page first.
Yeah. Generally, when I hear the term, I think about parties kind of being switched around, reorganized, people switching parties again at the kind of voter level as well as the elite level. Maybe having a center switch parties or something like that. That's kind of what I think about, and I'm also thinking very specifically about time period. Sometime between, say, 1950 and 2000, give or take, something's happening with the two major parties in America.
Right. Okay. Well, good. That's what I was thinking about too. So that's good. It typically, I think when most people hear realignment, they're thinking about primarily the capture of the South by the Republican Party. I don't want to limit us to just talking about the South. I want to kind of talk nationally if we can. But yeah, I think it's that the complete reshaping of what it meant to be a Republican and maybe what it meant to be a Democrat. I'm interested in your take on that between, about in the post-war period for sure until about when do you think the process is complete?
That's part of the hard question here. For me, I tend to lean towards a much later date of it being completed. I do think it started maybe as early as some people think, but my end date's really probably around maybe the 1994 elections, getting the Congress controlled by the Republicans for the first time in a while. Both chambers. That seems to be maybe where that's completed, where you start to actually have a fair number of Southern congressional spots now being captured by the Republican Party. But I'm open to kind of other time frames as well. But
Sure.
that to me feels like kind of the end of that.
I'm trying to think, and this is research I should have done ahead of time. When was the last gubernatorial office in the South that flipped Republican?
Off the top of my head, I don't know. I do know that there were a number of them that year that had not been since Reconstruction that ended up flipping that year. So that to me is kind of and again, especially Deep South positions, right? Getting a lot of, places in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, place like that had not flipped since Reconstruction. So that seems like a pretty serious indicator.
Right. I'm trying to think, and yeah, and because I'm wondering if Sorry to kind of sputter here, but yeah, I think you're right. There's a couple of states that were into the 2000s, maybe even before they actually.
I mean, there's a bunch of the South that will not do so in the 90s for sure. But the majority's been pretty much captured by that point.
Sure, and there's also the reality that the National Democratic Party and state Democratic parties are very different.
There is that, and then there's also, one of the biggest, I think, indicators that people often look at is like you seats changing hands or whatever in the 70s, 80s, 90s is most of them overlook the fact that some of that is not because, the local electorate or even the people running for those offices change positions per se. It's largely that the people who had held those positions died out.
Sure.
All these guys start dying out. A lot of the Southern Democrats like Harry Byrd and people like that are they're dying out by the end of the 60s or a little later. And
Right.
Thurman's one of the few that is essentially in this period before realignment and then is persisting until the end. And I mean, there's several others as well, but he's kind of the biggest name probably from South
Right.
Carolina. So
Okay, well, let's start with Strom Thurmond. Maybe we'll tell. I mean, I think Strom Thurmond is sort of the way that the story is typically told to some degree. So why don't we start with Strom Thurmond? Maybe tell me a little bit about Strom Thurmond.
yeah, so Thurmond is a unique character because he comes into uh, political power not at the kind of congressional level first. Starts out at local level, ends up being governor for a while and all that. But he ends up getting to the Senate as a more independent mind than the Senate usually appreciates, I think, at a certain level. And there's a great story of by that time Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson getting mad at him after a certain vote, and I forget the specific vote now, but as they're walking out, LBJ grabs his elbow and tells him, "That's not how you're supposed to vote." And Thurman says, "Nobody tells me how to vote," essentially. So that's kind of the man who comes in. But yeah, I mean, the way the story's told is that he's just some uh, radical segregationist, racist, and that he creates this, what's he hated the actor or the nickname, the Dixiecrats, in 1948. He is the nominee for president of this party that he had hoped was actually going to be more national in scope than that. And that's part of why he hated the Dixiecrat label. He didn't think it just should apply to the southern states. Um, but he ends up
And the actual name was States Rights Party.
States Right Democratic Party. Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's what he wanted to use was he wanted it to be seen as kind of this rebuke of centralized federal power, essentially, and not just on, say, segregation or something like that. But the Dixiecrat label gets applied, and that's how almost everybody remembers them, for better or worse. And that's really kind of where he gets his claim to fame before jumping to the Senate. And once in the Senate, though, he will, he'll make a name for himself doing several things, including he will filibuster Civil Rights Bill 57, and will actually do so against the better judgment, if you will, of the so-called Southern Caucus, the Southern Democrats who were opposed to this. They actually didn't like the idea of trying to filibuster it because they thought they could just let the bill get through and they'd weaken it enough maybe and just let it go, and that it wouldn't really upend the system. And so they didn't want to push back too much. But he's going to come in, he's going to filibuster, he's going to make his name for himself. But then he's also very famously, he's going to switch parties. And he's going to be arguably probably the most famous political leader in American history to do so. He's going to do so in 1964. He's going to switch from the Democrat to the Republican. He's going to back very voraciously Senator Barry Goldwater for president, for the Republican nomination. And in doing so, though, again, he's painted as in most narratives anyway, as doing so because of the issue of segregation and the racial concerns. There's some truth to that, for sure. But then there's also this component that I think it was his biographer, Crispino, was the one who highlighted this the most, but he drew attention to actually looking at the voting record of Thurman. And that Thurman, in fact, comes into office in the mid-50s, roughly, and he's going to actually vote overwhelmingly with the Republicans, pretty much from the get-go. And actually, I think in 57, 58, maybe those 2 years, he has a more consistent voting record along with the administration that is President Dwight D. Eisenhower. He's voting more in line with that administration and their agenda than any Republican in the Senate. So in many ways, he's already Republican.
Right.
If we think about it in those terms, right?
So why would Thurmond in 1964? Why is that sort of this watershed moment of 1964?
Well, again, most people say because of civil rights.
Okay, so what was? Can you talk a little bit about the civil rights and the 1964 election?
So '64 and the lead up to that, obviously there's a bunch of chaos because JFK has been assassinated the year prior. His Vice President Lyndon Johnson has now taken the helm, and in so doing has essentially leveraged JFK's death to kind of push this agenda of civil rights, as well as what he sees maybe completing the New Deal in some ways, getting more social safety nets and these types of programs through. And so,
What he labels a great society.
what do you label as a great society? Absolutely. Um, and this comes in, and so many folks are seeing these things that again may have done some good, in the short and the long term. But many people, including I think Thurman and Barry Goldwater, see this as potentially government overstepping what it should be doing, and creating maybe an atmosphere where the loss of liberty and freedoms and whatever is going to actually occur. Now, there's obviously some arguments I think for both sides of that, but that's how I think Thurman's viewing this, and I think he's also viewing it as many people have, is that the Democratic Party was changing, and that it wasn't Thurman who changed his mind. And he actually will very famously say, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party; the Democratic Party left me," is what he will say. Now, again,
Though he was voting Republican all the way back.
he was pretty much voting Republican the whole time anyway. So in some ways, it was just something to mark in the ledger, not something ideological, like shifting or reversing or flipping or whatever. And instead, it was more of a making what was actually be. Right.
Okay, so in the '64 election, when scholars, people talk about realignment, the '64 election gets pointed to
Yes.
for reasons that you've already, for some reasons you've already mentioned, such as Barry Goldwater's the Republican nominee, and he is going to run against Lyndon Johnson, who is running. His platform includes this massive expansion of federal government power. In many ways, a sequel to the New Deal is how he will articulate it to some degree, and that it will be, except unlike the New Deal, which was conceived and executed at a time of desperation, the Great Society is conceived and executed at a time of relative American affluence.
Yes.
So look at how successful the New Deal was at a time of poverty and desperation. No one imagine how successful we'll be at this time of affluence. Um, and so Goldwater gets the Republican nomination, and Goldwater personifies perhaps, and he's senator from Arizona, personifies perhaps the opposition, the alternative to Lyndon Johnson's vision of the role of the federal government.
Yeah.
Right. What does that mean in the South?
Yeah. So for many Southerners, they see this as, I think, a rejection of what had been, what would be kind of called the New Deal coalition. I mean, this idea of how the government's going to be expanded, the role it's going to play, and obviously the way that politics and race are going to interact.
Okay. How would you explain that?
Yeah. So again, at this time, Jim Crow is still the status quo, is having, segregation, public spaces, having that. There's been some challenges by this point in terms of kind of access to universities and things like that have happened in the '40s in Texas and a few other places. But by and large, segregation is still the rule, and that's the status quo in a lot of places. In a lot of places, it's by this point too. You're also having what's called massive resistance, this rejection of integrated schools that had been brought in by Brown v. Board,
Which was 1954.
Yep. And so a huge response to that across the South. In terms of other aspects too that are recreating some of the South as well, is you're increasingly seeing whites moving out to the suburbs in a lot of places, Atlanta, Charlotte, places like that are reshaping some of the political landscape as well, because that's just obviously going to redistribute some of the voting, and as well as some of the wealth for school districts and things like that, of course.
And now in these suburbs are no longer just Southerners because the economy is growing in the
Yes.
South and attracting Northern professional migrants.
Yes. Yes. So you're having a new wave of that. And you're also having, thanks in large part to World War II, there had been a great expansion of military bases and also just federal infrastructure in terms of things like nuclear facilities and things like that, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Los Alamos, New Mexico, which is not technically southern, but in the southern part of the United States, that has redistributed people from all over the nation to come to those areas for both work long term, and then also maybe they come down there like, I really like it down here, I'm gonna stay after my time in service ends or whatever, and so that you're gonna see that kind of redistribution of things as well.
Right. Okay. So I mean, there's this general migration happening anyway, and I think this is something that oftentimes gets, I think it gets acknowledged, but I don't think it necessarily gets the emphasis that it probably should. Whenever you're seeing big party shifts political in the political landscape, or I mean, maybe I should rephrase this. Whenever you see big migrations, you're going to see changes in political affiliation and partisanship and political structures
Yeah.
as people take their voting habits with them, or they're coming into a new society, into a new culture, into a new community, and you're bringing different values are coming in and they're shaping third types of values that are coming out of it. Maybe people who agreed with maybe people who agreed with each other were diffused across an entire region. Now they're concentrated, or they were formerly concentrated and now they're diffuse. Um, so there is this, after the Second World War, early Cold War, huge northern, huge might be significant northern professional migration into the South at the same time that you've got this southern migration into the suburbs. And now they're living in similar communities, maybe next door neighbors.
Yeah. And this also happened, I mean, talking about migrations, you go a little further back, you have, depending on how you want to phrase it, the first and the second Great Migration, or just the big Great Migration from World War One to World War II. And you're having the first wave really goes up north, concentrating kind of, Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, New York, Boston, all that. And then you also have then the second wave during World War II, again, as these bases are getting expanded in the South, as well as California becoming the central point of departure for the Pacific Theater. You're having tons of bases there and tons of construction of shipping and things like that. So tons of Southerners, black and white, are gonna go westward, and they're
Right.
move these places, as well as, again, obviously the Dust Bowl too pushes a whole lot of people during that same period, uh, which, as you said, you end up with, like, say, Orange County, California, becoming heavily concentrated with a ton of kind of Okies and people from Texas as well that are coming there, fleeing the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression and all that, coming there for work, and that's going to reshape, at least short term, their politics as well, where they're going to again vote very heavily for Barry Goldwater 64 there. So
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. So I think there's this myth out there that the myth of the solid South. Okay. That the South was rigidly democratic from before the Civil War
yeah,
until the 1964 election, where in that 1964 election, the Republican Party wins Mississippi, Alabama, and is there a third state that it wins, or is it just Mississippi and Alabama?
Louisiana.
Louisiana. Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say I thought it was three states.
Yeah,
So the Republican Party wins Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, and that is typically attributed to the fact that Barry Goldwater um, opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Bill,
yeah,
right? And Barry Goldwater did it, at least according to Goldwater. The reason he did it was because he thought it was a while he sympathized with the policy, he didn't think that the federal government had the right. Basically, am I getting that wrong? Or
no, no. Though I do want to. We missed a few states.
okay.
It's Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina.
Oh, really? I didn't realize Georgia and South Carolina went
Yeah,
as well.
yeah, yeah. I forgot that. Uh, well, not South Carolina. That should have been obvious with old Thurman's. You
Yeah.
know, campaigning for him. But yeah, basically the Deep South.
The Deep South.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the Deep South, which has been the bastion of Democratic power at every level, really since the Civil War in 1964, it's clear that it is no longer that bastion of power. However, it's not like the Republican Party has been completely missing in the South in that period.
No, no. I mean, it's not that they've been missing entirely. It's that their ability to win consistently has not really been there. Again, especially in the Deep South, the Upper
Sure.
South, Tennessee, Texas, places like that that are kind of on the outer edge. There's been some victories. I mean, John Tower in Texas can win the Senate seat after that's vacated by LBJ going to vice presidency. He's going to win that special election. I mean, there's some other cases, but yeah, that kind of central core of the Deep South hadn't really been chipped away at. And again, this is where some of the changes to the Deep South need to be understood in terms of not just switching parties maybe or things like that, but also the changes to the political landscape as the Great Society, particularly the Voting Rights Act of '65 comes into power, is that's gonna shift and open the door for way more participation by African Americans in those states, where I mean they were single digit, registration in places like Mississippi and Alabama. After this, they're going to go, more than 50% of people who can vote are registered to vote, and so that's going to potentially shift things. But again, that's not a flip. Those are not people who were voting Republican and coming now to vote Democrat or vice versa. It's simply an infusion into who can vote Democrat in those states, and is going to actually, I mean, if that's the argument, that huge influx should maintain the so-called solid South then because they're going to vote Democrat.
Right. Yeah.
And so that, that doesn't seem to help the argument of, well, this is why they become Republican.
Right.
Because in many of these states, especially again, those Deep South, they're a huge percentage of the population.
Well, Mississippi and South Carolina, I mean, through this period, the African American population exceeds the white population.
Yes. And so that's going to reshape that, but it's not going to make Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia flip to Republicans, right?
Right.
And so that's part where that logic or that perception doesn't seem to make sense with the argument that we're having great realignment in this period.
Right. Right. At least not on at least not on that issue.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So okay, but let's talk a little bit about the Republican Party in the South before 1945. During the New Deal, they aren't particularly apparent, but they aren't really apparent pretty much anywhere in the country other than their traditional homes.
Yeah.
During the New Deal. But in the 1928 election, for instance, the Republicans are very competitive at the presidential level in the South. They win, I'm just going to check this here. They win Tennessee.
Yeah.
They win Oklahoma. They win Florida. They win North Carolina. They win Virginia. It's really only the Deep South that stays Democrat.
Yep.
And even then, it is competitive in those states. Now, there's a lot of reasons why the 28 election is that way. Okay. I have my own argument that I'm not going to necessarily fully present here, but one of the key issues is that Al Smith, who's the Democratic candidate, is Catholic
and wants to end prohibition,
and he's a wet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he is from the northeastern urban New York Tammany Hall wing of the Democratic Party. And he is not the kind of guy that Southerners look to as a typical ally.
No.
He the South, which is predominantly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant of the people who are voting, tend to be very supportive of prohibition, even if they themselves were not particular adherents to it. The favorite way I saw this explained in a newspaper article that as usual, our constituents vote dry and drink wet, both with great enthusiasm.
Yep.
Um, But Al Smith is this candidate in 1928. He's this Catholic he's governor of New York, um, uh, Catholic, wet. For instance, his like campaign theme song is "Sidewalks of New York." I can't imagine somebody in like Lowndes County, Alabama, is going to get really enthusiastic about "Sidewalks of New York" as your campaign song.
No.
And so, um, and in Smith's defense, like he's also on the least racist part of the Democratic Party, and he's going up against Herbert Hoover, who was a very much a prototypical dry, um, not a Catholic,
Nope.
um, had some notoriety as a considerable amount of notoriety as Secretary of Commerce under Coolidge and maybe Harding. I don't remember if he was Secretary of Commerce under Harding, but
So
um, and in the 28 election, basically the Democrats hold the Deep South, but it basically kills them to do so.
yeah.
Unlike and they lose the Upper South and they lose the West. I mean, other than the Deep South, the only state Smith wins is Massachusetts.
Yep.
So I say all that to say that this idea that the Democrats had a total lock hold on the South, especially at the presidential level, was never quite accurate.
No. I mean, I think the story is, as you very astutely put it there, is very more complicated than that.
Right.
That this period is not that way, and this is also, I think, part of the issue of defining all this and trying to create the periodization of it is most people are never looking at the same levels of this politics. And so you have a ton of people that are looking at, they're looking at only congressional voting, or they're looking at only, presidential elections, or they're only looking at local elections. And I think if you look at all three of those more kind of together, you're going to see that, again, the story is more complicated than that, but also trying to use especially presidential elections to say, oh, the solid South exists or it doesn't, or these cracks in it or whatever that are happening, I think misses the point, because presidential elections are not the only elections. And if you really look at who controls kind of governors, mayors, Senate seats, House seats, you're looking at still pretty much complete dominance by the Democratic Party for the entirety of the 20th century. I mean, they basically control that. Now, again, there are elections like this is, and this is not the only one. 28 is not, where that's going to shift. But even after, for example, after 64, yes, they're both Southerners, but Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, they're going to win the South in both cases. So if realignment's happened, how do we explain that? Is that just an anomaly? Is that just, because they're, supporting their own people because they're Southerners or something like that? Maybe, but that's a hard sell for me to say, okay, the party's switched, the South is now Republican. Well, then why do they vote overwhelmingly for two Democratic nominees? So to me, that's a big challenge, I think, to that notion of like that's happening. And this is why, in my opinion, I really buy into his name is James Sundquist, and he wrote it's 1973 um, about the dynamics of parties, and he put forward the argument that again others have picked up since then, but the notion that instead of maybe realignment, we enter this period of de-alignment, where people are not switching parties, but they're becoming less attached to their parties. And so this maybe allows for in the South where, you can have people vote for, Herbert Hoover at president, but then every other, down ballot vote is Democrat. Or same thing with Eisenhower, same thing with others. It's that you're having this more mixture thing instead of just like, oh, you're voting only Democrat or you're only voting Republican. And instead you're getting this sense that, well, there's not really a huge difference between the two. How does one maybe benefit me more than the other? And again, if you look at this from the elite quote unquote elite level, looking at kind of senators and Congress people, their perception about this is by the 60s anyway, is the parties, there's really not that much difference. And so switching parties doesn't really do anything to benefit them, especially these older folks like, say, Richard Russell of Georgia, who is one of the most senior members in Congress at the time. He's going to lose all of his positions of seniority. He's going to lose all of his chairmanships of his committees. He's going to lose all that by switching parties, unless he can work out a deal where maybe they grant him some of that power. But if they're not in control, they don't have that power to grant those same seats or those same positions. And so in many ways, people like Richard Russell, like, there's nothing to be gained by switching parties like Thurman did, because Thurman didn't really have those positions.
He was kind of an outcast a little bit in the Democratic caucus anyway.
And again, he had also arguably worked out a backroom deal to make sure he got some seniority given to him for the switch.
It wouldn't surprise me if some Democrats were not too disappointed to see him go.
No.
I mean, he launched the largest Southern assault against the Democratic Party in 1948. He led that.
Yeah.
Right. And then, after he gets into the Senate, as you mentioned, and I didn't know this, but that his voting record is largely Republican.
It's overwhelming.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, and when I say overwhelming, I don't know, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it was at its height was somewhere around like 91%.
Wow.
Voting with the administration and their bills and their plans.
Wow.
Which is incredible.
Okay. And for the sake of completeness, I'm also just going to mention that the Republican Party existed in pockets throughout the South, like permanently through this period. Places like the Western North Carolina, particularly Eastern Tennessee, the mountain communities, which had historically been a little more unionist in the Civil War. So they tended to maintain that unionist allegiance kind of connected them into the Republican Party. And I don't know, there's like in the Shenandoah Valley, was there much Republicanism in this period?
There was, and again, largely going back to the more pro-unionist stance of a lot of folks in that region. Maybe a little less so than what becomes West Virginia, but still to a greater degree than most of the rest of the state.
Right. Okay.
Definitely.
And like a lot of the time that Republicanism is in families. Like this is a Republican family and has been a Republican family since the Civil War. Yeah. Right. And, and families like that would benefit, they're not going to win power at the state level, but if you're an elite in that group, when there's a Republican in the White House, they still need patronage positions to fill in that state. So they'll fill those positions. Yeah.
And I mean, just for example, I mean, my grandfather's line, they've been in the Shenandoah Valley for generations, and he was a Democrat till the day he died, but I would argue he wasn't, he was much more conservative in a lot of senses, but he had that, party loyalty that a lot of those folks did who came through the Depression, who, lived through all that and had grown that attachment to the party in a sort of way that, they just never got rid of it.
Yeah. And I think there still are quite a number of those people in the South who are absolutely rock solid Democrats still, even though they are very, they're white. In many ways, they resemble a white, maybe not the most white maybe not the most conservative person you'll meet, but they're still like white, relatively conservative person, might even live in rural South or suburban South, but they're in their 70s or 80s and they're still rock solid Democrats.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, again, and that just, there is some stickiness there, and that maybe, and the process has not either fully completed or
there is.
So, all right. So in the realignment itself, again, the periodization that we're giving it is the 40s through the 90s. But I think there's this really acute period or really aggressive period of it between, and maybe what Sundquist called de-alignment. Maybe that's the period that we're talking about between 64, and we've kind of talked about 1964, and then the Nixon campaigns.
Yeah.
Where Nixon very clearly is, recognizes that Southern votes are up for grabs in 68 and 72.
Yeah.
In 68, though, it's a little complicated by the fact that there's a third party.
It is. Yeah.
So let's talk maybe a little bit about the 68 elections.
Yeah. So.
And the South.
Yeah. So 68, again, probably one of the most substantial kind of third party challenges since maybe the populist, in terms of actually kind of winning elections and maybe taking away votes in that sense is former governor of Alabama, Wallace, is going to come in, and he's going to, offer, I think in his mind, much the same way that Thurman and the 48 challenge did too, is putting this as, we're not just challenging kind of the change to the racial status quo or, getting rid of segregation, all this stuff, but we're challenging kind of this expansion of federal government in the same way and trying to do so again to attract kind of a broader national audience. And I mean, Wallace is going to go not just throughout the South to the campaign, he's going to go up north. He's going to attract large audiences in places like Ohio. And
There's a major rally in Detroit.
yes, yeah. And so, I mean, this is happening in his mind much more nationwide than, now again, is he going to win all these states? No, but he's going to challenge substantially in enough places to really kind of throw a wrench on this. And again, I mean, this is also in the context that I think is important of 68 is the Democratic Party has completely imploded in a lot of ways, and we probably don't have time to get into all the nitty gritty details.
Yeah, the gory details.
Of all that, but I mean, the big part is that the Vietnam War is going badly. The perception is that it's going badly, even though saying that the Tet Offensive in 68 did not actually, it was a military victory for the American military. However, the perception was that
Terrible propaganda.
yes, and then most Americans had been buying into the idea that the war was going well, that we were winning, and then this happens, and how can that happen if we're winning, right?
Right, and that just for people who are listening, that like that, the Tet Offensive includes this surprise attack across all of South Vietnam by Viet Cong and NVA soldiers. They get so far as the front lawn of the United States Embassy.
Yeah.
Right, and this is after several years of being told that the Viet Cong and NVA are basically on the run.
Yes.
And now this might have been to some degree a bit of a last gasp attack, but
It's not seen that way by the American public, and again, in part because very famously, LBJ and his administration been selling this idea that the light at the end of the tunnel was there, that we were near the end, just a little longer, and then it's like, well, what is this then, right?
Mhm.
How is this possible? And so that's a huge challenge. So, in light of all that, as well as some other kind of more personal, maybe health issues, he also decides not to run, and so that opens the door for it not being the incumbent sitting there campaigning. It's
an incumbent Southerner
an
too.
incumbent Southerner who had, garnered a ton of support from the South. And now the door opens for, it's a power vacuum essentially. Like, who's going to take it? And then obviously, very famously, probably RFK, Senior would have gotten it. He gets assassinated, unfortunately, the campaign trail. And so then that again complicates, well, who's going to take over? Who's going to run? And so I think Wallace sees that too and really kind of plays up on that as like, this is a possibility because, maybe the Republicans aren't as strong as they could be nationwide. And then the Democrats are in chaos.
Well, the Republicans are in such bad shape, they're running Nixon.
Yes.
I mean, like, I mean, it sounds silly to say now because, of course, Nixon not only wins that election, then wins the most, I still think the largest historic landslide in 72.
Yeah, it's one. Yeah.
So, I mean, very, very powerful president, obviously, but I mean, this is a guy who lost the presidential race in 1960. He lost the governor's race in California in 1962 or 64. 62, right? So he's not, I mean, yes, he's coming with some momentum 6 years later, but at the same time, Nixon is hardly a bulletproof candidate.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so, I mean, you're right. I think he sees this opening.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, the 65 Civil Rights Act, 64 Civil Rights Act, 65 Voting Rights Act has, and then the 1964 convention and the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, where you had the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party try to get themselves sad, and Johnson had to strike a lot of deals in order to prevent that from happening.
Yeah.
You've got a South that feels very alienated from the Democratic Party, or a white South that feels very alienated from the Democratic Party. But Wallace doesn't sweep the South.
No.
He sweeps the Deep South.
Yep.
Again. But the other states, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Florida, Oklahoma, go Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is, those are the states that went Republican with the addition of South Carolina in 1928, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I don't want to say that nothing is obviously things have changed since 1928 by 1968, 40 years later. But one of the things that you're seeing in those states, particularly in places like South Carolina, North Carolina, and Florida, is the growth of major metropolitan cities.
Yes.
And with big suburbs,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, so you're you're seeing this willingness maybe to vote Republican, and of course, the northern professional migration continues. The Sun Belt is beginning to emerge,
Yeah.
as a real thing.
Yeah.
Um, and the Sun Belt, for people who don't know, is the idea of the industrial South that comes out of the Second World War, kind of defined by cities, suburbs, not the agricultural agrarian sort of tradition of either the Jim Crow South or the antebellum South.
Yeah.
Um, and but this is a strategy on Nixon's part.
Yeah.
Right? He knows that, like, these votes are available
Yeah.
to him. But, and Wallace's presence on the ticket, I think, kind of represents that this is the last gasp, though, of the segregationists under Wallace.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think so. But I think it also, I think that this whole election also gets complicated by part of the reasons why the Democratic Party is also imploding is uh, both kind of observers at the time, and obviously, scholars since then have kind of pointed to this too, but very much breaking apart because of two issues: the Vietnam War, which you just mentioned, right? But also what is again described by multiple people as violence in the cities, core,
Sure.
right? And so the shift, as most of these northern cities in particular, uh, feeling that the racial changes for the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were much too regional and changing things, and it didn't really, get rid of things like redlining or whatever in northern cities, where essentially it wasn't by law, but there was still segregation essentially happening.
Sure.
Right. And so,
Well, the expression I've heard is, segregation's a northern technology.
yes. Yeah. So you have these, these places where now, instead of allowing kind of both blacks and whites in the north to point the finger at the south, they're having to look in the mirror and go, maybe we have problems too. And this creates a ton of tension in a lot of northern and western cities as well. And this is also, again, same time you're getting, the rise of Black Panthers and all that. So you're getting this shift of kind of maybe working within the system to fix it, and more of a, for lack of a better words, revolutionary approach of like the Black Power movement, this whole.
Sure. I mean, and it's happening alongside the emergence of the New Left
Yes.
as a major political force.
Yeah.
And I think the New Left is absolutely involved in splitting apart the Democratic
Yeah.
Party.
Yeah.
I mean, Hubert Humphrey, who was the Democratic candidate in 68, vice president under Johnson, very famously is like speaking to a group of New Lefters saying, "Are you really not going to vote for me? Like, if you don't vote for me, like, Nixon's going to get it."
Yeah.
And the response from the crowd is like, "We don't see any difference between you and Nixon." And that must have shattered Hubert Humphrey.
Yes.
The poor guy.
Yes. Which is, I mean, because I think there were great differences between the two men personally, but I do think that, that notion, um, and this is an image I often show in my classes too when I'm teaching this period, to again illustrate the shift of kind of thinking about 68, the Vietnam War, this period, eh, that again is to me still a shocking image. Is 68, marchers walking down the street in Chicago, not necessarily at the convention, but around that same time, in that kind of summer, um, waving the Viet Cong flag.
Yeah.
So waving the flag of people who are literally killing Americans on the other side of the world. And these are folks that are, obviously against the war. Some of them may not actually vote at all. I mean, that could be too. But they're seen, right or wrong, as the left. And they're seen as, if you vote for Democrat, this is what you're voting for, kind of projection. And so Nixon's able to sell that idea that, like, that's not who we are.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, and that's what Nixon really runs on,
100%.
right? It's he's against the hippies. He's against the drug guy. He's against Timothy Leary. Drug legalizers, drug users, right?
Yeah.
And then of course against the Abby Hoffmans and Bill Ayers of the world.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I mean, I think that's an attractive. I mean, obviously, it's an attractive message across the country because of look at how the 68 victory is pretty considerable.
Yeah.
I mean, other than, um, the it's a big victory, and if you include the wall of states,
Yeah.
the Democrats, it's a pretty terrific defeat for Democrats.
Yeah.
Um, but the reason I wanted to bring up Wallace and maybe the 68's the last gasp of segregation is that in 72 segregation is no longer on the ballot anywhere.
No. Yeah.
In 68 it is still on the ballot.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Even if it's just anger or resentment or like these voters need to tell the Democratic Party we are upset.
Yeah.
By 72, and I think Nixon recognizes this in his feral political mind, recognizes this, that if civil rights is not on the ballot anymore, what's the difference between somebody living in Hoover, Alabama and Rockford, Illinois? For a white voter, and those are suburbs of cities.
Yeah.
Right? Or a suburb of Atlanta and a suburb of New York City.
Yeah.
Right? What you get after 68 is the Republicans, for the first time since maybe ever, but certainly since the end of Reconstruction, they can be a national party.
Yeah.
And that's once civil rights is off the ballot, you realize, like, hey, you've got this accountant, you got a white accountant in, outside of Mobile, and again, and a white accountant outside of Indianapolis. They probably had the same concerns.
Yeah.
They probably have the same worldview. The only thing that separated them was civil rights.
Yeah.
And now that that's off the table, they're united. And they both hate the Great Society.
Yeah.
And they both hate the hippies.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they really hate the new left.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, increasingly so.
No. And I again, the reason I'm kind of maybe hitting this point hard is because I think the general way that this is understood is that it's the Republican Party needed to become racist in order to become a national party.
That's how it's sold. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas I actually see the opposite. I see that it was race coming off the ballot that allowed suburban people and exurban people across the country to recognize that they actually had something in common. They had a lot in common. Not saying they were correct or anything like that, but that you actually have the makings of a national coalition.
Yeah.
Of this, I'm going to use it, of this petit bourgeois, white, professional petit bourgeois white coalition.
Yeah.
And that will continue. And I think it just grows. I think that's, many ways that's what we're talking about. It's the growth of that coalition.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it will bring in farmers. It's going to bring in some working class people here and there. But the Republican Party, which was, I think historically, and maybe you disagree with me here, but in the first half of the 20th century was the party of the professional white North.
Yeah.
And then it becomes the party of the professional white nation after 68.
Yeah. I mean, I would say part of the changes too, and you've kind of like hinted at a lot of them so far, in terms of kind of who's coming to the South after World War II, let's say, and what's changing with this kind of suburbanization period as well, is that I think what you actually start to see too is part of what allows for the Republicans' appeal isn't so much race or the lack of race or whatever in the equation, but it's actually the greater increase of kind of a business middle class.
Yeah,
In the South that allows for Republicans to kind of grab hold of people, which is why again most Republicans, I think most people have this kind of misperception that it's like a bunch of rural, racists that are flocking to the Republican Party, and it's actually not the case. The people that are by and large doing so are, like white collar workers in Atlanta or Charlotte or Richmond, Virginia, a place like that are slowly kind of recognizing that maybe this is the best option forward. And again, race is certainly a part for some of them, but not the key issue. And I mean, uh, I think the best example of kind of this issue of realignment or de-alignment or how the South changes is really put forward by Brian Schaefer and Richard Johnston about the end of Southern exceptionalism, a book they wrote in, I think it's 2009, that makes the argument that this kind of period of realignment or de-alignment or change to the South is, again, not driven by changes so much in racial politics, but actually in economic concerns of the South, and that you're starting to see, again, greater investment maybe coming in, or factories and things like that that are reshaping who and what these people are concerned with in terms of kind of politics or issues. And obviously, I mean, the Vietnam War in and of itself is a huge contributing factor to that. Um, as is oil shortages in the 70s and things like that, right, are all playing into this as well in terms of reshaping these notions. But again, if it's so simple as going from a solid South to Republican South, again, the story of Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton complicate that so hard so that it's like that doesn't make any sense at all if that's what's happened or is happening. Um, and nor do I think you can explain both of those men simply as, oh, it's Southerners supporting Southerners or something like that. But that's not the only answer either.
no, I think you're right, and I mean, but I think you see it with, like, just with Clinton, for instance. Clinton appeals to the professional middle class across the country. So why wouldn't he appeal to the professional middle class in the South?
Yeah.
And Carter too. In '76, he appeals to the professional.
And he is also coming in. I mean, I don't think it can be overstated either. He's coming in as not to compare the two politically, so to speak, but he comes in much the same way Donald Trump did. He comes in as the outsider. He's saying, "I'm not part of Washington. I'm not part of this." And he doesn't call it the swamp like Trump does, but he says, "I'm not part of that.
Yeah.
I'm coming in to clean that up." Instead of having this, president who essentially got appointed. Ford, nobody ever really voted for the man to become president, right? In that sense, and then it's like, does he really care about us? Does he, is he part of the system that's exploiting us, or whatever? And so Carter's able to come in and really sell that as, I'm the reform candidate, I'm the outside candidate, I'm representing you because I'm just a poor peanut farmer too, just like you.
Yeah.
Except that's obviously a little exaggerated, but very true in some ways.
Oh yeah, humble origins for sure, and veteran, and but he also, like, one of the things that I think that the group of voters that we're talking about cares about typically is transparency, and they're typically very fastidious or conscientious about um, government corruption.
Yeah.
And is it any wonder that they voted for the Democrat in 1976,
Yeah.
given the few years before that?
No. And I mean, not the only reason, obviously, Clinton's the same way is, Bush had promised no new taxes.
Yep.
And the economy went into the tank, and Bill Clinton said, he promised you something. He didn't give it to you. He instead, gave you the shaft, essentially, right? And is, hurting the economy or whatever, and he's not taking it seriously. He's not concerned about you, right? And
Right.
so Clinton's able to sell that idea very seriously that, like,
Yeah.
again, he can come in and fix that, and, in some ways he does,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, which is why he gets his second term.
Right.
I mean, that whereas, the first Bush did not, right?
Yeah. Right. Well, I don't want to take up any more. We've already gone on for almost an hour, and I know that you and I could go on for 3 or 4 more hours about this.
Yeah.
But we'll probably have to continue this discussion, or we'll keep alluding to it at other times. But thanks very much for sitting down, and I really enjoyed it.
I appreciate it.